Along Venezuela's Caribbean seaboard runs a spur of the Andes. This is the view enjoyed by most visitors from North America as they approach the land of Cerre Bolivar. The spirit of Bolivar, who liberated northern South America from the yoke of Spain a century ago, is strong among Venezuela's 5 million people. The progressiveness that he engendered is strikingly evident in his birthplace, Caracas, the capital city with a population of 700,000. This is a center of commerce and culture. It possesses a fine university, beautiful parks, squares, boulevards, residential districts, and some of the most modern apartment houses, hotels, and public buildings to be found anywhere. South of the mountains lies a vast, sparsely inhabited region known as the Guyana hinterland. Through this region flows the Orinoco River, which empties into the Atlantic. When the delta was ascended by Spanish fortune seekers in the 16th century, they found Indians living in palm-thatched huts along its banks. The huts were perched on poles as protection against floods. Inland lies a vast area of jungle and savanna. One of the largest of the many tributaries of the Orinoco is the Cerro, which flows northward from the interior. About 50 miles due south of the Orinoco and somewhat west of the Cerro stands a certain hill, 1 mile wide, 4.5 miles long, and 1,800 feet high. In 1947, after 2 years of intensive investigation in Venezuela, geologists of United States Steel Corporation discovered that this hill, now known as Cerro Bolivar, was encrusted in iron ore. The geologists filed claims and set up a camp as a base of operation. They got around in 4-wheel drive trucks and jeeps, and both the men and their vehicles were put to some severe endurance tests. The exploration survey, which resulted in the discovery of Cerro Bolivar and adjacent iron ore deposits, was conducted under the direction of Mac C. Lake, consulting geologist and mining engineer, and F.H. Kielstedt was the engineer who personally led the discovery group. Mac Lake was destined in January 1950 to be the first president of Orinoco Mining Company, a U.S. Steel subsidiary formed to develop the deposits. Supplies were brought up by every available means, including tractors and burros. A churn drill was set up to plumb the ore body. Wagon drills pressed against a sheer surface to begin an exploratory tunnel. By now, the facts were known. Cerro Bolivar was capped with a thick deposit of high-grade iron ore. It contained more than 400 million tons, averaging about 58% iron. Plans were made for production and shipment at an initial annual rate, once full production was achieved, of 5 million gross tons, with provision for expansion to 10 or more million tons. It was one thing to locate this ore body. It was quite another thing to develop it. Orinoco Mining Company proceeded to solve a major problem of logistics. First to bring in supplies and equipment, and then to get out the ore and carry it to market. Camps had to be set up. A road and trackage had to be pushed across grassland and jungle between the hill and the Orinoco, where crushing and handling equipment, an integrated part of the mining operation, and port facilities would be needed, while a channel would have to be dredged for ore-carrying vessels. One spring day in 1952, a bulldozer crashed through the thick growth at the confluence of the Cerro and Orinoco, clearing a site at the future port for a construction camp. Thus started a long-range construction program, one of the most ambitious ever undertaken by private capital in a far country. Construction crews lived in houseboats tied up to the shore, supplemented by tents on high ground nearby. A new community was in the making. Puerto Ordaz, it was to be named, after the first Spanish explorer who sailed up the Orinoco in 1531. In May 1952, a strange craft appeared on the Orinoco, being towed upstream. It was the largest steel structure ever built in the form of a barge. and it came from U.S. Steel's Consolidated Western Steel Division yard at Orange, Texas, 2,500 miles away. It was 82 feet wide, 376 feet long, 15 feet deep, and weighed 2,250 tons. It was the first of 3 identical barges that were to be fixed end to end to form a revolutionary type of dock for the handling of cargo and the loading of ore at Puerto Ordaz. Bulldozers and scrapers pushed and carried great quantities of fill for a shore approach. When the barge was maneuvered into its final position, a remarkable operation ensued. On the deck were carried 26 100-foot lengths of steel pipe, 6 feet in diameter. These were to serve as caissons or piles on which the barge would eventually stand. One at a time, the caissons were hoisted to a vertical position by a 100-ton capacity crawler crane. Then they were dropped through wells on each side of the barge in 2 rows of 13 until all stood on the river bottom. The next step was to raise the barge to pier height, which had to be above flood stage, an elevation here of about 40 feet above low water. The hoisting was done by a combination of ingenious air jacks. Fitting over the circumference of each caisson and attached to the deck, the air jacks climbed the caissons much as a boy might shinny up a tree. With all the jacks operating in unison, every time their upper halves were raised 6 inches, the whole structure went along with them. When the barge reached its ultimate height, the big crane swung into action with a steam hammer weighing 40 tons. One at a time, the jacks were released while the caissons were driven home to bedrock. After that, the projecting tops of the caissons were trimmed to deck level. As the season advanced, the 2 remaining barges in succession were brought from the Gulf Coast to Puerto Ordaz. They carried on deck not only their 26 caissons apiece, but also a great deal of heavy freight. When all 3 barges were fitted into position, they became a permanent, heavy-duty, all-purpose dock, 1,128 feet in length. This unique dock saved months that would have been expended for a conventional one of comparable size and strength. The initial freight for pioneer construction had been lighter to shore, but only 11 days after the arrival of the first of the caisson barges that formed a dock, a supply ship was able to come alongside to unload. From that time on, all manner of freight, no matter how heavy or bulky, could be unloaded promptly. Before the end of the project, about 300,000 tons of material and equipment would have crossed this dock. Not only were pieces of heavy construction equipment coming ashore, along with thousands of other items immediately needed, but also rolling stock for the mine transportation system. Southward along the route to the Cerro Bolivar area, roadbed was rapidly prepared. The highway, which would generally parallel the rail line, had first priority for the moving of construction supplies. Truck convoys carried cargoes of all shapes and sizes. Here and there, deep cuts had to be made in the rolling savanna to maintain the proper gradient for the trackage. As part of the program for the ore gathering system, the contractors had to erect 13 major bridges across tributaries of the Caroni. They also had a couple of underpasses to put in and several thousand drainage structures. As operations extended ever farther along the route, outposts called fly camps were set up at intervals for the accommodation of equipment operators, surveyors, and their helpers. House trailers were adapted as mess halls as well as sleeping quarters. And thanks to modern refrigeration and kitchen facilities, the food served was always varied and wholesome. Parties of surveyors pressed on through savanna and jungle with a special group wielding machetes to clear away undergrowth for a view of the line ahead. They toiled up the slopes of Cerro Bolivar, surveying right-of-way for the tracks that would be winding to the crest. construction crews gained a foothold around the top of the hill. Bulldozers swept the loosened material down the slopes, and the track grade took shape. Before the end of 1952, all remaining gaps in the supply line were filled in. The ribbon of right-of-way winding around the hill was now connected with a new highway which ran northeastward 90 miles to the Orinoco. In February 1953, Benjamin F. Fairless, chairman of the board of U.S. Steel, inspected Cerro Bolivar. He was accompanied by a group that included M.W. Reed, executive vice president of U.S. Steel, and E.M. Voorhees, chairman of the finance committee. It was a happy occasion for Mac Lake when he led these men into an exploratory tunnel to see for themselves what lay beneath the surface of the hill. Through the months that followed, drillers patterned the hillside with holes, into which charges of dynamite were loaded. Power shovels with 6-yard buckets cleaned out the blasted ore to make new access benches. Current would be needed for a new electric shovel for maintenance shops and other installations on the hill. And to carry that current, poles were marching up the slopes. Wire stringers followed the pole setters. In the valley near the base of the hill, a large new building contained 2 diesel generators which would supply power to Cerro Bolivar and also to the nearby town site of Ciudad Piar. Here was a miniature modern city whose creation was part of the Orinoco project, with row after row of houses for the mine workers and their families. The Orinoco River, one of the world's great waterways, was to be conditioned for direct northward shipment of iron ore. This necessitated the dredging of a total of 32 miles of the 172-mile course from Puerto Ordaz to deep water at the Gulf of Paria. While shorter than the Mississippi, the Orinoco brings down about the same volume of water, reaching a flood peak in August, heavily charged with sediment. A long-range program of channel improvement was started in March 1952. Hydraulic dredges dropped their cutter heads to the river bottom and sucked up sand and silt and pumped it to the shore through large diameter pipelines floating on pontoons. Altogether, some 33 million cubic yards were disposed of in 19 months of operation, opening up an ocean-going ship channel 250 to 400 feet wide at low water. Astonishing changes had taken place along the Puerto Ordaz waterfront by the fall of 1953. In the course of just a few months, a combination of complex steel structures had risen against the sky. These were the ore handling facilities which were now almost ready for operation. To furnish electricity for the ore handling machinery and all other industrial and domestic needs of the new community of Puerto Ordaz, a powerhouse had been erected on the nearby bank of the Caroni River. Another vital installation was the permanent water system, which went on stream in mid-November. Water was pumped from the Orinoco River to a modern plant. The volume treated was 1 million gallons per day, which, with a few modifications, could be stepped up to 2 million. Puerto Ordaz had lost much of the rawness of a construction camp. Many of the permanent houses were already built, furnished, and occupied. Eventually, Puerto Ordaz, like Ciudad Piar at the mine, would become a full-fledged little city with recreation buildings, bachelor and family quarters, church, school, hospital, cafeteria, commissary, and laundry. Indeed, the laundry was already in business. It was a wonderful asset in a climate where clothing quickly wilts and soils. Still carrying on in temporary quarters was the Puerto Ordaz school, but its staff and the number of its pupils had grown with the coming of more and more resident families. In the Puerto Ordaz yards, complete and up-to-date shops were being built. Here all major mining and operating equipment, including rolling stock, would be kept in condition. All this time, the ore gathering system between Puerto Ordaz and Cerro Bolivar was nearing completion. Of great importance was a rock quarry 28 miles south of the Orinoco. Here crushers produced aggregate for concrete and ballast for grades on the haulage system. From a pit beneath a stockpile of ballast, a belt brought up carload after carload through a tunnel to a loading ramp. The roadbed was finished, but ballast cars continued their work, hauling crushed rock for the final grading of the track. Altogether, some 425,000 cubic yards of rock of all sizes had been produced and sent out from the quarry. After the spreading of the last ballast, the shoulder of the roadbed was evened off by a special plow. Just behind, a pair of power jacks lifted the track to its final position. An electric multi-tamper followed the power jacks, its steel fingers probing into the ballast and compacting it. Under the guidance of an instrument man, the rails were moved into precise alignment. The rail system was now virtually finished except for sidings on the hill itself. Where the roadbed wound to the crest of Cerro Bolivar, it was found economical to use local iron ore ballast rather than ordinary rock. Among the visitors who observed progress at Cerro Bolivar was Clifford Hood, U.S. Steel's president, who arrived in mid-November 1953. Guiding the Hood party was Francis Thomas, Orinoco's new president. To all visitors, it was an unforgettable experience to stand on the slopes of Cerro Bolivar with some of the men in immediate charge of development and examine samples of ore, particularly on the eve of production. On the 27th of November, 1953, power shovels on the hillside worked with special intensity. They were loading dump trucks in quick succession. The trucks rolled to a temporary platform alongside the tracks. Here were standing the first ore cars to have been put ashore at Puerto Ordaz only a few days before. They had since been hauled to Cerro Bolivar and were now receiving their initial consignment of ore. A 60-car trainload was being made up for an experimental inaugural run from Cerro Bolivar to Puerto Ordaz with some 4,000 tons of ore. It was on a Sunday, when track work was at a minimum, that the ore train began its descent from the hill. The train was now on the steepest grade on the entire line, 3.1%. 3 diesel-electric locomotives of 1,600 horsepower apiece pulled the 60-car train. When mining operations were in full swing, there would be as many as 120 cars at one time. Smoothly, the train reached the foot of the hill. From here on, there would be no adverse grade in excess of 0.2%, except for a few short stretches which the train could overcome by its own momentum, and no downgrade of more than 1%. As the first ore train neared the end of the line, another milestone in the history of the Orinoco project was passed. Soon the ore brought by that train would be crushed, stockpiled, and poured into ships which would carry it to blast furnaces in the United States. Loaded cars were shunted to the base of a ramp, and from there they were fed into a massive steel frame. one after another at a rate up to 67 per hour, their loads were dumped into a primary crusher. As soon as each car was emptied, its place was taken by another. Tons or more at a time were dropped into the maw of the giant crusher. Here began an extraordinary procession. Out of a tunnel from the primary crusher pit, moved the ore on a 5-foot wide belt and upward to a secondary crusher, which reduced all chunks from a maximum of 9 inches in diameter to 5 inches or less. The belt system at a speed of 600 feet per minute swept the ore aloft to the bridge, a huge movable structure mounted on rails with a span of 400 feet. The ore cascaded onto a storage pile that could grow to 700,000 tons. Under concrete slabs at the base of the pile were 2 parallel tunnels, in each of which were 2 traveling plow feeders. Huge bladed arms rotating horizontally scraped the ore from a shelf onto a collecting belt. A river of ore flowed toward its destination. It passed through a plant which automatically weighed and sampled it. Thence it was shifted to a transfer house where the belts changed direction and ran it out onto the dock. In the transfer house, an operator at a central panel could control every phase of the entire operation with constant two-way communication all the way from the car dumper to the dock side. By means of a loader moving on rails along the dock from one hold to another, ore could be fed into ships at a rate up to 6,000 tons per hour. But this might one day be increased with the installation of additional equipment to as much as 12,000 tons. January 9th, 1954 was a gala day for the people of Puerto Ordaz, a day that began at the local airport, when reporters, photographers, and distinguished visitors from Caracas arrived in special planes. Most distinguished of all the visitors was Colonel Marcos Pérez Jiménez, President of Venezuela, who came to inaugurate the operations of Orinoco Mining Company and dispatch the first cargo of ore. The President, his party, and all the guests drove in official and private cars from the airport to the dock. A decorated and canopied flat car served as a speaker's platform, and a crowd of Venezuelans and North Americans gathered expectantly before it. The Bishop of Guyana bestowed his blessing. Francis Thomas spoke on behalf of Orinoco Mining Company.
La Orinoco Mining Company hoy mira hacia el futuro.
Then President Pérez Jiménez spoke. The first shipment of iron ore from Cerro Bolivar leaving this port is of great importance to Venezuela, said the President, as it marks the beginning of the technical development of this valuable wealth on a large scale. Gentlemen of the Orinoco Mining Company, I am glad to formulate the most sincere wishes for the increasing prosperity of the firm that you represent, and that its activities contribute to the progress and the strengthening of Venezuela. President Pérez Jiménez pressed the button that caused the ore handling machinery to go into action for the pouring of the last few tons to complete the loading of the first ship to carry Cerro Bolivar iron ore from Puerto Ordaz. It was a ship called the Tosca that had the honor, and she was bound for the east coast of the United States with 6,000 tons. No sooner was the Tosca away from the dock and heading down the Orinoco than another ship maneuvered into position to receive the second consignment of Cerro Bolivar iron ore. In holiday mood, over 3,000 guests converged on an especially prepared area adjoining the new administration building to enjoy a barbecue luncheon. This happy celebration marked the end of the construction period and the beginning of production only 2 years after the Orinoco project had started. 10 days later, and 2,000 miles from Puerto Ordaz, a proud ship steamed up the Delaware River. As she approached Philadelphia, she was escorted by a flotilla of tugs and fireboats. A delegation boarded the Tosca to bid welcome to her and her captain. The hatches were opened to display the cargo. In the group were the mayor and the Venezuelan ambassador, the American ambassador to Venezuela, the chairman of the Port Authority, and U.S. Steel President Clifford Hood. Gifts were exchanged, including a silver box of Cerro Bolivar ore, which Captain Smonte Haydin presented to the city of Philadelphia. On went the Tosca 30 miles farther upstream to complete her voyage. Her goal was a dock near Morrisville, Pennsylvania, the home of the new Fairless Works, where iron ore from far places was being smelted and processed. On the morning of January 20th, the dock was closed in by mist that lent an aura of drama to the scene as diplomats, officials of United States Steel, reporters and photographers gathered to witness the unloading of the first iron ore from Cerro Bolivar. It was Benjamin Fairless who gave the word to the operator of the boat unloader.
Frank Rossi, are you ready?
Yes, sir, Mr. Fairless.
Proceed.
This ceremonial sample of ore spilling into a box was the first fruit of years of exploration, of planning, and of labor, but not on the part of U.S. Steel alone. It was the result of a cooperative effort in which the people and the government of Venezuela joined, and it exemplified what real and enlightened international cooperation could do to advance the welfare of mankind. So it was that iron ore from a remote hill in Venezuela found its way into the blast furnaces at the Fairless Works. But here its usefulness was only beginning. Soon it would be turned into steel in many forms and commodities. However, it was on his first visit to Venezuela when he met President Perez Jimenez that Benjamin Fairless spoke of another commodity far more precious than iron and steel.
That commodity is friendship, and that above all else is what we seek. The kind of friendship that grows from mutual understanding, mutual respect, and mutual confidence.